Welcome to the drafting and sewing of the French cuff. I'd like to start out by showing you a couple of French cuffs. One is actually a convertible. Convertible is just like a regular barrel cuff, except it has buttonholes on both sides and can also be used as a regular barrel cuff. Now the one on the left is a true French cuff. And the reason I brought this up in a graphic is because I'm going to show you how not to draft one like this. The whole goal of drafting a nice French cuff is to make sure that these edges always cover the edge of the stitching on the bottom, to be elegant. So you don't want this, and I'm going to show you how to draft it from scratch so it doesn't happen to you. And also keep in mind that from the fold, the button normally is anywhere from 3/4 to 1 inch. The reason being, most men like to show the cuff lengths, and normally the sleeves are a little bit longer than a normal barrel sleeve. And so I just want to bring those. We'll continue by going to a live shirt and giving you some more detail. Okay, continuing, I'd like to give you some more information from a live shirt, as I call it, on the French cuff. The first thing I want to let you know is that on the button side is normally folded to the wrong side. Now I'm going to give you a close-up view so you can really get an idea of what I'm doing, because it's important to realize these things. So again, it's folded to the wrong side, as you can see. Now normally, as we'll discuss in the pattern drafting, the part that adjusts to the actual sleeve at the wrist is normally smaller than the outer diameter. And the reason being, again, is that we need this part to be covered. So again, I'm going to go ahead and fold it into its position, matching the buttonholes. And you can see that the bottom does not show. That's the reasoning behind that, so that when it's actually folded and put in its position. Now let me put a cuff link in there just to show you what we're doing, because it is important to realize this. Lining up all your buttons and what ultimately happens to the French cuff. Now it's in its position, and you can see that when it's worn, you won't see the bottom piece or the stitching, and that's the whole thing. It gives it an elegance that you need. That's what custom shirt makers shoot for. Now in this position here, you're looking at the width of the cuff. Now it's kind of deceiving because this is not actually the width of the cuff. Now I'm going to take the cuffling off again and show you what I'm talking about. Turn it to the wrong side. The actual width of the finished cuff is on the wrong side, from where it attaches to the sleeve at the wrist to the fold. In this case, it's 2 3/4. Now, if you look at the outside, the finished side that the public looks at, and you measure the whole thing, it's 3 inches. And the reason being is because it has a 1/4 inch overlap to cover the stitching at the wrist on the sleeve. And so this is very, very important. So this gives you an idea. Now, what I want to do too is I want to give you the actual, on the other sleeve, I've taken the liberty to take the French cuff off. And I'll show you again also the pleats. Now what happens when a customer wants a longer or a bigger size of French cuff or barrel cuff, any size? Well, what happens most likely is we'll end up making this pleat smaller, or in some cases it's removed totally because we need that room. So this is something to consider when you're replacing French cuffs, or I should say when you're changing barrel cuffs and replacing them with French cuffs. When you're analyzing it, make sure you're going to have enough pleat to accommodate the new length size. And again, the button side is always folded to the wrong side. Now some of these store-bought shirts have what they call a continuous placket, which is very, very small. Sometimes they're 1/8 in width, which is very hard to put a button on, not impossible. But normally in custom we use some type of width. It's normally anywhere from 3/8 to a 1/2 inch or maybe even 3/4 wide, so that when it closes, it has a real smooth close. And you can imagine if it didn't have that overlap, what you try to do is you try to button it, and it wouldn't fold properly. And so that's pretty common among French cuffs. You'll first make sure that you especially when converting from barrel cuff, that you fold over a piece. Then you'll actually know how much room you have for the length of your French cuff. And then, like I said, in most cases, there are usually a couple of 2 or 3 pleats, which will give you the ability to make the cuff longer to accommodate a larger wrist. And in the next segment, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the actual drafting, and you'll see what I'm talking about when you're drafting, to make sure that the top of the French cuff covers the bottom at the wrist. And we'll go through the drafting, and then from there we'll actually go and fuse it. We'll fuse the interfacing on the fabric, and then I'll show you the procedure for sewing it, some alternatives, several methods of how we actually construct the French cuff, and also the placement of the buttonholes. And we'll continue. Okay, continuing, we've explained a little bit of details about the French cuff, but how do we go about drafting it? Well, first of all, you have to know what size you're going to need. So in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that we're going to make a 9-inch French cuff in length, and we're going to assume also that it's going to be finished. It's going to be 5.5 inches finished. Now, on top of the 5.5 finished, we need to add 3/8 for an overlap. Most custom shirt makers add 1/4 to 3/8. I'm going to add 3/8, so that's a total of 5 7/8. Now I'm going to show you how to draft it. Now the first thing normally I do is I'll grab my square and I'll square a couple of long lines, and we're going to assume again it's going to be 9 inches finished. So what I do is I square 2 long lines. Like, yeah, hopefully I can get this dark enough so you can see it on camera. And this will be the squared lines. Remember, they're right angles. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get my ruler, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure off 9.5, because we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance that we're going to need on this. So it's going to be 9.5 from end to end, and I'll just go ahead and put 9.5 on there. And what I'll do is I'll make a mark, and then I'll square a line. Now always verify your work. So I'm going to square a long line. And remember what I said about it's going to be 5 7/8. Now if you're confused, the easy way to do it is, let's say you want yours 2.5 finished. Well, the first thing you would do is you would mark off 2.5. I'll show you just simple so you don't get confused. And then it's going to be folded, so you know you're going to need another 2.5. And then you know you're going to need 3/8 for overlap. And you know you're going to lose a 1/4 up here, so you need to add another 1/4 inch. And that's easy without being technical. And then what you would do is you would square a line from that bottom piece straight up. And always verify it, that both sides are the same. It's 5 5/8 here. And this one here is 5 3/4. And 5 3/4, so my line is off a little bit, so make it right. And this is where you start learning about checking everything. Okay, so we have our cuff, and right now it's 9.5 in length and 5 3/4 in width, but we know we're going to lose 3/8 for overlap. Okay, so now remember I showed you about you need the top part. We're going to assume that this is going to be the top that's going to overlap at the wrist. So we need to take a 1/4 inch. Normally I'll take a 1/4 inch on each side. Now the lines may appear a little thicker, but I think you'll get the idea. So what you'll do is you'll come in a 1/4 on each side. Now normally what I do is I usually go more than half and make a mark, and I'm going to show you why. In this case I'm going to go 2 3/4. I'll make a long mark here. 2 3/4 on each side. And these are just guidelines now. And so what I'm going to do now is from the 1/4 that I came in at the wrist, I'm going to go into that line and mark it. And do the same on the other side. Okay. And this, as I've already stated, is going to make sure that this top piece covers the stitching at the bottom where it attaches to the sleeve at the wrist. Now, this is a square, And remember, 1/4 inch seam allowances are allowed. Now there's a couple of methods that I'm going to show you in the sewing. Now normally what I do is, since the interfacing in most cases is white, I normally back out the seam allowance. So you know that seam allowances are 1/4 inch. And I back out the seam allowances everywhere. Now this is just another method. You can leave the seam allowances in if you want, and then when I trace around it, I will cut the actual cuff template less the seams. And in the stitching you'll realize why. But for now, at this point here, I'm going to leave the seams in. Okay? And also, let's say you decide you want to make round French cuffs. Well, I have a little tool that I created, and it's included in a folder for those who have purchased the pattern making course. And you notice one has an angle, one has a little bit of a short round, and one has a wide round. So let's say in case that we want a big round, you could just trace it and save yourself time. And normally what I do is I only do one side. And I normally cut the cuff out in the square. And I'm going to show you that next. After I cut it out, I'm going to show you how to contemplate how your buttons are going to line up. So we'll continue.